I'll be recording this webinar, and once it's completed, I'll send the copy of the recording out to everyone, and also a copy of the chat window as well, so in case you miss anything in there, you can come back to it again. Like I said before, thanks a lot for taking the time out to attend. Before I hand over to Helen and Tabitha, I think the question from the Jisc side is why are we doing this professional services staff survey? A lot of it was coming from feedback from different institutions who wanted the survey, and some institutions have actually started to do the survey themselves. There was that kind of level of demand for it. So, you know, when we were starting off, we were speaking to some of these other institutions to find out how they got on doing the survey, you know, what came up, what surprised them, etc., and try to build on that. Also, we felt it was the missing piece here. So we've obviously always had the student survey. We've added to that just had the first year of the full service for the teaching staff survey, and we felt that the missing part obviously was the professional services staff. You know, when we're working out what we started from, the student digital experience, obviously teaching staff are crucial to the student experience, but so are professional services and their relationship with students as well. And of course, professional services staff also have the influence on teaching staff. So we can see from the digital experience perspective how all of them relate together. And this is what Helen and Tabitha have been wrestling with this survey, and also looking at the questionnaire, trying to revise it and thinking how we can see commonalities on some of the questions that we can ask for next year. So we'll move on to the next slide. I thought it'd be useful to have a picture of all of us here. So I've gathered all the different photos together, so you can see Helen and Tabitha, who are working the consultants, who have done the survey, looking at the questionnaire design, have done the analysis for the professional services project itself. There's me in there. There's also the service manager and Ruth on the call today. Sarah can't make it, and also we have Claire, who's our content manager as well, and my email address, and so is Ruth's at the end of this presentation. So if I can hand it over to Helen and Tabitha, just to say that this year has been a pilot, so thanks all of you taking the time out to do the survey, and we'll be moving into a full service for the new year, or this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. This is Helen. If you can move the slides on, that's brilliant. Thanks, everyone. We seem to have lost our headers, but this is just a kind of reminder of where we're up to. And it would be really useful if you could put in the chat window if you have actually taken part in the pilot at your institution. So we just have a sense of who we've got in the virtual room, who's in that position. This was, as Mark said, a pilot. It's a chance to have a good old rummage around in some of the responses, particularly the free text responses, and some of you may have been sort of aware that there was a lot of free text in there. We weren't expecting all those free text questions to stay in. We put them in because there were some quite big questions we had around, for example, who exactly this group of professional staff were, how best to partition them, what kinds of experience they could tell us about, and we really wanted to use the pilot as a chance to surface some of that. So the pilot survey included some questions we wanted to test out that we thought might end up in all the surveys potentially, and some of those have piloted really well. As I said, the free text questions to help us ideally to design some closed questions, because we all know that closed questions are easier to analyse. We just didn't want to go diving right in with closed questions when we hadn't really surfaced all the nuance there might be there to surface. And the pilots have completed. So you, if you've done one, have downloaded your data and benchmarked it and used it, or beginning to think about how to use it, and your experience is going to be really valuable to us. I'd really urge you to fill in the evaluation survey if you haven't done already, but also to use today to tell us, you know, more about what you found and what the survey was like for you. We've got a draft report written, and it's been with Jisc for a while to sort of finalise and complete and send back to you. And hopefully you've had a chance to look at the key messages from that, which I just stuck into a PowerPoint to make life easy. And if you have that PowerPoint with you, with all the results in and all the charts in, it's going to be a lot easier to follow as we go along. So if you haven't got that, I would suggest go and look back at your emails from Mark and just get it in front of you so that you can go through and look at the results as we go. Because there's no point us putting up on screen everything we've sent you for your private reading. The other thing to say is that there's every opportunity today to help us to shape the key messages that come out of that report, and also to have some input to the survey question redesign. Although we've done a lot of work on that, we're still open to thoughts about that if you have any. I'm going to ask Tabitha and Mark if you want to add anything, because this is sort of important stuff, and then we're going to go through the findings, but this sort of overview is really important. So just see if anyone else in the team wants to add anything before we go forward.
Hi Helen, hi everybody, it's Tabitha here. No, I'm good with that. We're just looking forward to sharing some of the messages and hearing your thoughts. It was really exciting to run a survey for professional services. We had a really good response, and we feel that it's an important addition to the Insights survey set. So yeah, very keen to discuss it with you and hear your opinions.
Yeah, this is Ruth here, just very quickly to say that we're hoping to launch the 2019-20 surveys next week. So if you have got any feedback on the professional service questions, then please do give it to us in the next few days, if not today during this call. Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you both. Mark, if you can move these slides on, we can look at the first quadrant. So yeah, I think we seem to have lost all our headings, so I'm going to have to remember what they were, Mark.
Shall I pull out your slide and upload it?
Well, we can go. We'll go as we are. That was just a slide to remind people that we had these 4 quadrants in the survey. Some questions have moved a little bit between the quadrants as we've kind of aligned all the surveys one with another, but there's an awful lot of continuity of the actual questions, just to reassure people about that. And as we go through now, we're going to look at the questions as they were in the pilot survey, obviously, so that you can follow them through in order. So moving on first to you and your technology. In that quadrant, what were the findings that were of interest to us? And obviously I've highlighted something from just about every question as we go through. This is my slide of key findings. The most important thing to us is what is on your slide of key findings. So you're on your digital technology. We found in our questions about how long staff had been in their organisation and in their posts, there was a lot of long-serving staff. A lot of staff had been in the organisation for 10 years and more, certainly far more than among teaching staff, for example. But within that, we found that there was turnover of roles, and that seemed to be particularly true in HE, that there was a bit more turnover of roles. So we've got a couple of slightly revised questions we think it's worth asking there, which we can talk to you possibly. But we thought they were useful questions for you to think about whether staff that have been in your organisation longer have a different experience to staff that have perhaps fairly newly arrived, and similarly with staff that have been more or less time in role. Won't be any surprise to you if you followed our teaching and student surveys that the questions on assistive tech were answered more by staff in FE saying that they do either optionally or necessarily use assistive technology. And again, more of those staff said that yes, they had definitely had support for the tech they needed. We had this new question we were trying out, which some of you will remember. There was a 4-part question about adoption. So which best describes your approach to adopting technology? And that actually was lifted, not quite verbatim, but it's certainly a question that's used in other surveys in that format. And not surprisingly, the norm was the most discriminating option, which is I tend to be an early adopter when I can see clear benefits. That was the mode for both sectors. And it was a classic attitudinal curve, really, going up and over. We thought it was quite nice to put in there. I'd be really interested to hear if any of you have tried to partition your data and look at whether staff at the 2 ends of that curve have a different experience with you. It'd be really interesting to know if you think that'd be a useful thing to do. But again, we've got a slightly different approach to that question as we roll it out across all the surveys. We asked about the use of personal devices for work, desktops, laptops, tablets and smartphones. And across all of those devices, there was a slightly lower use in FE, but the pattern was very similar across the 2. One of our key questions for understanding the staff and student digital experience is the question about who supports you most for using in your digital practice, whether that's your practice as a learner or as an administrator or as a IT support professional, whatever your role is. And no surprising that in among these professional staff, other professional staff are the people they turn to most for support. The free text confirms that there's a huge amount of staff-on-staff support, a lot of it informal and a lot of it within teams, which I could go on to say a bit more about. But other than that being a really very, very high, I think the results to that question were not surprising. Not surprising that on-demand video, a kind of LinkedIn, lynda.com kind of on-demand video services is turned to more by staff in HE, but then we can look at the question about access and see that they're much more likely to have access to it. So what we don't know from that is whether more FE professionals would turn to that kind of service if it were there, or whether it's simply part of their cultural practice to turn to the people around them. So that's my summary of the kind of interesting things from you and your technology. Again, other members of the team, feel free to come in on what were your highlights, but the main thing here, if we go on to the next slide, is to hear from others of you in the virtual room.
Helen, I have a quick question from Chris asking about assistive ed tech. Chris, did you want to speak now?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay. It was about the term assistive technology, because I wondered, especially thinking about how many staff have been in the institutions for such a long time, whether you also include as assistive tech anytime you increase the text size on a Word document or on Excel. You know, at what point does assistive tech become everyday tech that's actually totally embedded into Microsoft, for example? I don't think you might need to have some guidance on that.
Well, in the, yeah, absolutely. So we use the assistive adaptive, and in the student and teaching staff survey, where we gave the opportunity to report on what tech people were actually using, we could see what you're describing very clearly. So we know that for a lot of people, absolutely, it's native functionality on their device or in their mainstream software that they're using. But we still think it's worth asking about, because we know that, again, from the free text, that a lot of those teaching staff and students still turn to a specialist for help in how best to use those features and functions, even if they're not getting the actual technology, they're getting the support to use it. And we have been looking at how best to phrase this question, whether, you know, we don't want to go too general and talk about something very abstract like inclusion, because we really need to focus on whether you've actually had help with the needs you have around your digital technology. But if we could find a better term than assistive and adaptive tech to use, we'd be happy to do that. So feel free to suggest a term that we might use there that you feel would you know, encompass all of those things we're talking about.
I think that the technology term means different things according to whether you're a member of a professional service. For example, you work in, I don't know, student administration, or, you know, backroom, academic quality, or whether you are a teacher. You know, so there is a context there as well. But perhaps that's the thing that gives you the information, the context by which in which the person is actually completing the survey, because, as I say, the terminology differs.
It's Tabitha here. One of the things that we have done with that question, as you know, is that it has two yes options. So it says yes, vital to my needs, and yes, an optional choice. And we've found that that's a very useful way to look at assistive and adaptive, to start to allow the concept of optional supportive assistive technologies to come into the conversation, rather than the assumption that has been in the past that these are only things that are needed when learners have special requirements. So that's been helpful to have those two options as yes, vital, and yes, optional choice. In addition, on the other side, one thing that we've brought in this year, or will be bringing in for teaching and professional service staff, is a question about whether or not you've been informed about the new equality and accessibility legislation. So at the other side, in terms of the kind of compliance of policies, we thought it would also be useful and interesting to, and also we were asked by a number of institutions to create a question that picked that aspect up as well. So there's sort of two ways in which we're trying to include that in the questions going forwards.
That seems like a very good point. I agree, because yes, the Equality Act for some institutions, you know, the additional provisions of the last year, isn't it, with the additional legislation, it is really making people think about what their offer is and what it should be to all staff, as well as to students.
Yeah, so it's part of our kind of, if you like, our as researchers and as service providers, it's part of our ethic that if we're asking students about a thing, we're also trying to ask staff about the same thing from their perspective, and also, ask staff in a way that doesn't put them on the spot too much. So we're always asking staff, have you been informed about your responsibilities, so that that they don't necessarily, that's the question that really we want the answer to, and not, are you doing the right thing? And I think that's kind of an important part of what we ask. But I mean, going back to Tabitha's point, the yes optional option, I think I'm right in saying is almost in every one of our surveys this year was used slightly more than the yes by necessity option from the same group of respondents. So, we can see that that's becoming, as you say, very mainstream.
There's a reply from Christine here about recognition of the digital champions in the team and recognising how colleagues help each other as well.
Absolutely. So in the report, the full report, when you see it come out, particularly from the free text analysis, there is a lot about the value that professional services staff get from one another, and that a lot of the support is happening in people very closely co-located within teams, managers, mentors, digital champions. So we have got a new question going forward that tries to identify this digital champion role without necessarily using the term digital champion, because it wasn't very widely used, to be honest, in the responses we had. But the concept was very widely explored, the idea of encouragement and signposting and just sitting beside someone while they did something. There was lots of free text about that. So we have got a question going forward that tries to identify the people who, how much people feel they're supporting one another, and making sure that organisational responses in this space don't preclude that, and recognise the huge value that it has for the vast majority of staff. So I think, definitely that's a really big issue in the report and in our thinking about the questions.
Thanks, Helen. There's one from ETF. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, it's Tabitha here again. We also, just to follow on from Helen, we were really interested in the importance of informal staff-on-staff support, and we wanted to try and include some data collection about this specifically. So Helen's talked to you about the new question that's going in about whether you actively help others to develop their digital skills. We felt that this was a good wording, and we'll be launching the question set, as Ruth said, next week, with a webinar to launch and talk through the questions the following week. But the other thing that we're interested in is the potential impact of strategies like, say, moving to hot desking on informal staff-on-staff support. So this is one of the reasons that we wanted to try and measure and reflect the comments about this, because there were a number of comments about this. And if organisational strategies move to systems that inadvertently break some of the informal staff-on-staff support mechanisms, then we're really sort of concerned to try and investigate that and collect that in the data. I mean, it might not have an impact, but certainly we were very struck by the amount of informal support, and this is something that's often not measured. Okay, sorry, Mark. Again.
No, there's a question here from ETF Digital, which I think was Vicky, about comparing the findings between long-serving staff and those not changed role and new ones. I can't remember exactly where those questions in the survey, and I imagine they wouldn't be in a briefing paper, but there would be something, time permitting, we could look at later. Do we, Tabitha, do we have questions in there asking people how long they've been in their role for? I can't remember now.
Yes, we do, but we haven't done the analysis specific to that. No, but that would be an option, yeah.
Be a follow-up, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I think consideration and will be quite informative on people who are perhaps more passive in their role and have been in their role for a period of time, may not be as enthusiastic in changing, and that would tell us probably effect on change culture, habits and mindset, which I think could be interesting in order to better drive change within organizations.
That's very useful, Vicky. I mean, I think one of the things we are asking about, and we did ask about in the survey, we could move on to the next slide, maybe, Mark, as we don't have a huge amount of time, was about the occasions on which people had spoken with a manager or with someone who could support them about their digital skills. And I can say to Tabitha and I really love this question. We love that we put it in. We thought the findings were really helpful and useful and very actionable, immediately actionable. And in line with our thinking about all of these surveys, the question itself is a kind of nudge to institutions about how to do this well. So here are 5 or 6 occasions on which you really ought to be helping staff to think about their digital development. And then staff get the chance to respond and say whether or not this has happened. So we love the question, it's definitely staying in. And as you say, as you get further on through your career, some of those opportunities may sort of get further in the past. And that's why it's really important to think about other ways of bringing these questions in front of staff, whether it's in staff meetings and so on and so on. So I think, Vicky, that's definitely a thing that we're on with the new question set. If anyone else wants to contribute in the chat window for now, just do keep typing. It's all brilliant. I'm just going to move on to the second quadrant, which is digital at your organisation, or in the new graphic is called technology in your organisation. And there's two slides of findings here, because this is the kind of real meat of how professional staff feel their organisation, and especially its infrastructure, is or is not supporting them to do their job well. And as for teaching staff and students, you won't be very surprised to hear that access is poorer in FE than in HE across all of these issues, and the quality and the access to facilities that we asked about. In the question about access to institutional technology, there were more desktops that were available from the institution and fewer smartphones than personal ones, which again is kind of intuitively what you would expect. The thing about access is very different across the two sectors, and that's borne out in all of the other responses. So kind of almost everything after this is against the background of that context. So, for example, FE staff are much more likely, when you ask them what one thing should we do to make things better, they're much more likely to focus on infrastructural issues than HE staff, who are more likely to focus on quality issues or support issues. But in fact, when you talk less about just basic access to stuff and about whether the stuff is any good, then the level of satisfaction is very much more similar. And I guess we could say that's because people know what they know. So most staff say that systems are reliable, not as many in FE, but it's not as big a difference as the questions about access. And when it comes to the two options within that question that are more about the impact of infrastructure, then, a large, nearly 2/3 of staff in both sectors say they feel confident to try new things, they try new functions and approaches. Now, obviously, that's largely a function of them and their professionalism and their willingness to try new things. But it also suggests that the infrastructure, whatever the issues with it, is not stopping staff from being, as they said themselves, willing to adopt new things if they could see the benefit. So I think we've got some strong messages about professional staff being potentially innovators, they're potentially confident adopters, but they have a lot to say about how infrastructure is not supporting them. And reliability is certainly the top issue for FE. There we go to the rating of infrastructure, and the rating patterns were very similar but slightly shifted. So again, FE staff were less likely to rate infrastructure highly, although, again, a majority of staff are rating infrastructure in their institution as being above average. And one of the things that I thought was quite interesting was that this pattern of difference between FE and HE, the pattern of findings rather, across FE and HE was much more similar to students than to teaching staff. So teaching staff are the most inclined to be critical of all three groups that we survey. Students and professional staff are more inclined to say that infrastructure is good or better than average than teaching staff, who are more likely to be critical. We could hypothesize about that if we want to. Turning to the suggestions for improvement, these I coded these out. I think I coded every single response in the end. And interesting to see that staff training comes high, network reliability and access to hardware is really important for staff professionals in FE. They're more likely to say, this is what you need to get right before I can get any better at my job. In HE, the infrastructure issues were more around system integration, quality of data processes, and flexible Hello, have I still got you?
I can hear you.
Totally good. Sorry, I think I dropped you then. But both, because of the quality, because it's quality data, it was possible to see what the impact of poor infrastructure was. And in both sectors, people talked about the impact on their efficiency, on their ability to collaborate with others in their team, and on their ability to work flexibly and remotely. So those were the three things that kept coming up when people were talking about what needed to be made better and why it needed to be made better. So we've got some good arguments here for the fact that infrastructure improvements, whether it's access, network reliability, or integration, will support professional staff to do their job better in these three ways: more efficient, more collaborative, and more flexible in how and where they can work. I just say a little bit about the work location, although Tabitha could maybe move on to this. That we did ask about where staff were working and gave them the opportunity to give some feedback about where they'd like to be working. And I think we were both quite surprised about this. I'll let Tabitha feedback on this one, because I know, Tabitha, you really picked up on this, on your surprise at the findings on this one.
Oh, I'm just, I'm on the back foot there, Helen. Remind me exactly.
Sorry, okay.
So I loved this question.
I didn't mean to do that to you.
There are so many surprises there. Lead me in for which.
A lot more people were working at their own desk than we expected. And it was you that put me on that.
Yes, so, okay. So yes, in that first question we asked about own desk work. I guess because, so I'm an associated, I work quite often in at a university myself as an honorary fellow, and there's been quite a lot of issues around hot desking and moving to that kind of situation. So I guess from that that bias that I have, you know, from my own personal experience, I was wondering about the influence of that, and I was really surprised to find that the vast proportion of professional services staff from the institutions that we surveyed in this are using a desktop at their own desk, and that's a location that stays constant. And I was really interested in this. And again, you know, I spoke earlier about the impact that may or may not have in terms of informal channels of communication, and knowing that someone's there, that you can go and knock on their door whenever, or you can, you know where to locate them and have a chat. And I think some of the people we've spoken to since then have also said some other interesting things, like, for example, when new builds are built, if there's not a large coffee area, then you know, that means that people can't informally get together and share practice and share ideas. And so I'm just really fascinated by this, the informal networks of communication, I guess. So that's how it relates to this sort of surprise. And I just wondered whether or not anybody else felt that really reflected their situation, or whether there is a suggested move towards a more hot desking style of work. Yes, what did you all think?
Well, and also, you know, so I think about 90% of HE staff were working mainly at their own desk, but if they weren't, they were more likely to be unhappy with it. Sorry, excuse the background noise. But most staff who were asking for a change were asking for more flexibility rather than for their own desk. I don't know if you want to move the slides on, Mark, to have a look at just asking other people. Really.
Yeah, we got a response from Christine coming.
Yeah, there's some interesting responses coming in about that.
And from Chris as well, yeah.
Mark, do you want to lead on that?
Okay. It says that we at the university are embarking on a space for the future project looking at hot desking. Basically, it looks like we need more desk space, but about a third of the people aren't always using their desks. So we have a big project looking at how space is used on campus, including home working, support needed, and bringing together student support frontline into one front-facing building. There does seem to be, I mean, obviously there's some universities have moved towards more sort of shared office spaces, hot desking for academics, and obviously that's been met with a lot of resistance as well. With professional services, I mean, I suppose it's varying by institution. I mean, what are the motivations behind it? You know, is it for, it's obviously to save money for universities is one thing, but how much is that obviously benefiting, or how much, what kind of working do people actually want? I mean, I think it's maybe that kind of hybrid. They want to have that desk, but they want the flexibility as well. I don't know, Tabitha, if you want to say anything extra to that.
Well, I guess it's just about personalisation, isn't it? Whether you're a learner or you're working at an institution, what the flexibility that you define as the most useful for your learning or working environment is not one that can necessarily be prescribed at an organisational level. I think we were very interested in, from the free text questions, what people felt was the most appropriate way for them to work. And some people do have to go across campus and work in a variety of different locations, and that has impacts on the devices that they need to support them, the infrastructure that they need, and the kinds of locations they'll be working in. So it wasn't as cut and dried as we perhaps initially imagined.
Yeah, it's interesting, Chris, you're saying about people were using kind of a docking station with their laptop so they can obviously work in different places and obviously team up with different people as well. And that's becoming more common, I suppose, for some professional services staff, not for others. But you can see that variability. I suppose one of the things also is having the hot desking means that you could potentially be breaking up a working team depending on the availability of desks at that time. So there's obviously a trade-off between creating new teams, but does it disrupt the existing teams that are working on a common function?
I think if we look at what staff themselves are saying, there's a huge appetite for working more flexibly, but the infrastructure at the moment, particularly in FE, doesn't always support it. So we've got 2 new questions going into all staff and students now about whether the organisation supports you to access organisational systems on your own preferred device, which is one part of being flexible, and whether you can access the things you need wherever you are. So whether you're on campus, off campus, or whatever, and those are the kind of critical aspects of flexibility as far as the technology goes. And we can intuit what the cultural impacts might be, and we can ask questions that have free text. We can look at the free text responses. But I think what we picked up from this was that far from people wanting to be stuck in one place, but there is an appetite to be more flexible in working arrangements. Working from home is obviously a part of that, but there's a frustration that the technology and the system integration isn't always supporting that.
Chris, you also mentioned about the use of mobile phones. We've been sort of concerned about how we integrate questions about use of mobile phones into the data set, because we suddenly realized that inadvertently there was perhaps an assumption by people reading the survey reports, or by some anyway that we've spoken with, that the use of mobile phones for learning was one that reflected exactly the same kind of behaviours as the learner or member of staff would carry out on a laptop. So whereas we suddenly started realizing, actually, when we were speaking to learners or staff, they were saying, well, no, I use a mobile phone to, say, look at the calendar of events, but I'll be looking at the online learning materials on a laptop. So please don't spend lots of time trying to redesign resources for a mobile environment if they're not the kind of resource that I'm going to use that device to look at. So I think
that's absolutely right. We do work in such a hybrid environment. I'm sitting here at the moment with my docking station. I'm also reviewing the phone because I'm actually getting texts and emails on the phone. Even I could pick them up on my laptop as well, but it's I work in, you can either call it a discombobulated or an integrated way. It's whatever's the easiest thing to hand at the time. And, I do it without thinking about it. And certainly, I think it's because being time poor, sometimes you grab the device that would be most suitable to the environment that you're working in. So, for example, looking at emails on the bus, making sure I'm not being shoulder surfed, GDPR, and that I'm not sending anything controversial, very mindful of that. But in fact, by the time I get to my meeting, wherever it is I'm going, I've got a bit of a heads up on possibly the agenda and that sort of thing. So, there's a point sometimes where the questioning to unpick that sort of mixed mode of operation possibly causes more problems. I don't know. I know at this stage, everybody is different. It depends on your institutional support.
I think it's interesting the angle as well as about well-being, because at Jisc there are offices people work in, but I don't know if it's the majority or many staff work from home and a lot of the time, which is great. And you really useful to have children, flexibility, etc. But then home and work life, of course, blends into one. So you end up mostly finding yourself working more hours than you would do if you were going to an office. And I think there's a way to cut that line off and say, actually, now I've done enough. And I think if there were questions around linked to well-being as well as where they work, that might be interesting in the future as well.
I think that's quite important, because I would absolutely encourage my staff not to be looking at emails on their phone and sending things out of hours. Absolutely. I have to, because I'm part of a major incident call-out group. So part of the reason for me having a phone, for example, is that I need to respond out of hours. But that's just me. Everybody else, I would very much respect their right to health, well-being and home life. Yeah. I think that there's a creep there that we have to make sure that managers are aware of the impacts on well-being for people who might just really intensively use these devices and kind of forget about the time. But I think
they do, and I think managers do say these things, don't they? And some staff, like you say, will carry on, and it's how do you persuade, or do you tell your staff you will not do it? Those kind of things, because it is it's a new working environment. We're working.
It was interesting to me in the free text how many respondents were conscious about these issues. I think there was an awareness in our teaching staff survey this year, but it was expressed quite differently. It wasn't often expressed in terms of well-being in the round. So professional services staff were much more likely to say, and this is particularly true in HE, I think, but they just tended to give longer responses as well. They were more likely to put into the same response issues around eyesight, getting your eyes tested, getting your workstation set up correctly, and by the way, work-life balance, general well-being, whereas academic staff were more likely to sort of say, particular stress around using particular systems, like often assessment systems seem to be ones that they pushed back against. But the vocabulary of well-being around the digital is definitely coming through for professional staff, and it may be that in universities and colleges they're really leading on those issues. And I think I put in the text box, are there things that you think from your responses or from your reading of the general responses to this survey, are there new things Jisc should be doing? We provide the surveys, hopefully so organisations can make some changes, but are there things Jisc could be doing around some of these issues, new advice and guidance to institutions? Lou McGill, I know, is doing some work specifically on digital wellbeing in the Digital Capabilities Programme, but maybe there's other things you've picked up on that we should be just taking on board. Mark, if there isn't more on that, maybe we should move on to quadrant 3.
Okay.
And look at some of the findings there.
We've got one response from Christine just coming into the chat window.
That's great, thank you. So quadrant 3 is in every one of the surveys now. It's about how technology is used specifically in your role. And it was very interesting that people in professional services, and we knew this was a very varied group of people, one of the most common responses in general was that both the technology and the training needs to be role specific. So there was an awful lot of responses, to say they've got no complaints about generically what's provided, but I really need to understand more about how technology can really help me in my specific role, or the software needs to be really fit for purpose for what I want to do with it. And I thought that was interesting because we did struggle, Tabitha and I, with thinking about whether we could in any way partition this data, whether we could think about professional services staff in different ways, and we'll come on to our attempts and limited successes in that regard. Thinking overall about what professional staff do, we found that FE staff were doing fewer of the digital activities we asked them about regularly than HE staff were. So the number of FE staff that are never doing some of these activities is higher than the number of HE staff. Again, it may simply be an issue of access to the right software and hardware, because we know from the infrastructure questions that that's an issue. So we would expect that therefore the level of activity is lower. And again, this is a good narrative to sort of be putting forward, that if the infrastructure is there, then people are doing more of these hopefully beneficial things for the organisations, creating materials, managing web pages, analysing data, having paperless meetings and meeting online and so on. When it came to the activities that we designated as being about developing yourself, the difference wasn't as great between HE and FE, but still there's some quite interesting and possibly negative findings here, that there are about a sixth to a fifth of staff never say that they never have their digital skills developed, and there's a mistake which is mine on this slide, but it's about half of staff never discuss professional, it should say, not teaching issues online. That's a hangover from the teaching staff survey. So there's a lot of digital development that could be taking place that isn't. So a lot of informal development face-to-face within teams. There's not a lot of staff, professional staff, taking advantage of their digital connectivity to develop their skills, to discuss professional issues in an online network that perhaps they might if they had the encouragement, or if it the time, or the clear signposting to do that. I didn't put up the 2 word clouds for preferred apps, but the most striking thing about those 2 word clouds was just how similar they were. I don't know if any of you followed our findings from the teaching staff and student surveys, but they're very, very different in the 2 sectors when you ask about preferred apps. Whereas when it comes to professional staff, they're very, very similar. And someone's already picked up on the prevalence of Teams in those word clouds. And yeah, quite a lot to unpick and digest there, I think, if we want to. So, Mark, if you could move on to the next screen. Sorry that these screens are quite crowded, but the general picture here is first that there was some difficulty in dividing staff into formal roles using our 3 categories of supporting students, supporting other staff, and supporting systems, because an awful lot of people said that they did all of those things. And it turned out, when you looked at the balance of activities, that an awful lot of people who said, for example, that they supported staff were not in a specialist role, let's say doing staff development or doing IT support, but were informally supporting other people in their team, maybe because they were in a managerial role or because they were a person who knew how to do this. So we didn't very successfully distinguish people who had those roles as a specialist, but we did very successfully find that professional staff are providing a huge amount of support within the organisation. They're supporting students informally, they're supporting and formally within roles such as the library and careers. They're supporting other staff, often informally, and they're supporting systems, often informally. And this is a really important ensure gets recognised. They do a lot of digital support. A lot of it's not necessarily part of their official role and not recognised. When we get on to what should be done more of, or what was recommended, top throughout the survey was that staff were saying they wanted more training. They wanted slightly different things in the 2 sectors, but overwhelmingly they said they wanted more training or more development. They wanted it to be relevant, timely when they needed it, relevant to their role, specialised, as I've mentioned. FE staff were more likely to say they wanted it to be mandated and accredited than HE staff, who were more likely to talk about time. But the responses really were, the profile of responses was really quite similar. And some of the things that staff were asking for were really kind of cultural. They wanted more recognition for the skills they had and they developed. They wanted their needs to be assessed. They wanted, again, better infrastructure. And they wanted some kind of sense that there was a vision for how this was moving forward. The final question in this section was asked only of staff who said they had a role supporting systems. And it was a very similar question to the earlier question about how should we support infrastructure. And what was really interesting was that when you ask that question, how should we support the digital environment, to people whose jobs are to support the digital environment, they really, the overwhelming thing they talk about is user engagement and the user experience, and having a complete focus on the user experience and user interaction. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that when you ask people in the know, that's the one thing they focus in on. I'm going to get quiet now and just ask other members of the team to pick things out, and particularly join in the discussion online about your findings from that quadrant.
So Tabitha here. I guess one of the things that we increasingly find is that, sorry, I don't know, there we go, is the importance of Mark, if you can go back to the slide we were on, that'd be great. The importance of time or lack of time in providing training support. So we're on quadrant 3 still, I think.
Yeah, that's the one, isn't it?
There we go.
Sorry about that.
So there with question 26 and 27, staff should have more training. There were some really nuanced and interesting trends that came out of that. So the idea of personalised training, you know, just in time issues, you know, look, I need something about something specific and I need it now in the next week. You know, that sort of flexibility of training provision was interesting. And similarly, the time to innovate, the time to investigate possibilities, including, you know, the use of digital or potential use of different digital technologies was one that came out frequently. I think there is a tension across learners and staff that we're seeing that comes with sort of, look, you know, you need to do these things, but we're not going to give you the time to do these things. And that's something that needs teasing out, I think.
Well, I suppose in that is the workload management as well, because I think as more training goes online and more asynchronous, I think people are given maybe perceived authority to do the training, but it's when do you do it? Because certainly we at Jisc have tried to sort of block out like Friday afternoons to do training or whatever, but if you've got a lot of emails in your inbox still or activities, yeah, so Helen, I appreciate that they're not necessarily wanting online, but I think it would be interesting to know how many HR departments are trying to push staff to go online for perceived cost savings or budget restrictions, things like that. So I think sometimes when people say yes, more time, more training, but it's whether institutions, how do they then respond to that would be quite interesting, given the perception that there's meant to be more, you know, students go to YouTube a lot more to find out information. Are staff doing the same? So I don't know if any, especially institutional people, have got any sort of insights into how your institutions are responding to just-in-time training for staff and also.
So we did see more HE staff than FE staff turning to video resources online to support them. And obviously self-directed learning is really important, isn't it? And you're always going to have those confident people or people who are confident enough in a particular area just to get a quick update. But then I think there are people who, you know, are lacking in confidence, for whom that's also in itself quite intimidating, and they're worried that they're going to be looking at the wrong video, or, you know, they're just not going to get it from the video, or they just need a sense, they need more kind of confidence than that can provide. So maybe it's about triaging people as to, you know, when they need one and when they need the other.
I think, Chris, thanks for your response here about self-directed learning is important, because of course people can choose the time they can do it rather than a particular time, you know, that obviously with people's busy workloads. And also that key thing that managers reassure staff that it's okay to take time out for digital skills development. The idea that, you know, taking time out is not part of their job or their role. Are they allowed to do it? They need that reassurance. And you've also asked the question, is anyone who has a feel for the take up of LinkedIn Linda as a training source? I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that. Are other institutions using LinkedIn, Linda? I know at Jisc we've had it, and I've personally not actually used it myself. I don't know, Ruth, whether you have at all.
No, I haven't. So that's where, you know, I think we're all individually as well as institutionally coming up against these challenges where, you know, your institution gives you access to some of these online resources and that, but it's, and even external online resources as their preference to face-to-face training. because of cost. But it's how do you really get disciplined in taking that Friday afternoon off to do some training when you've still got a lot of really other urgent work to do. So we have Fuse as our HR department, so that's like an online portal for different, like a e-portfolio type system with resources on there that has access to lynda.com and other providers like that.
So Christine, you've come in and said that you're a part of your digital skills training online. You've got a digital skills certificate, so giving some kind of validation for the training people are doing as well. And obviously there's still a need for face-to-face, but maybe that kind of badging might be an idea. And you had a recent focus group with more online training than face-to-face. I suppose the sort of thing, maybe online training, you can be more flexible about what time you want to take it. And also some people might be more shy and not want to do face-to-face. They prefer doing online training. Again, it's triaging people, as Helen said, to whatever suits their personality or their work style or workload or etc., or the type of training that it is.
I think it's interesting that upgrades and updates featured so much in the free text data. I actually at one point had a completely separate code, but then I disaggregated it again because it seemed to be relating to slightly different things. But I think upgrades and updates are, they're a classic for online training, aren't they? Because it's not a major practice change. It's just a kind of what's new, what do I really need to know, and they're a problem in the perception of a lot of professional staff in that they come along so regularly, but they're also an opportunity in that because they come along regularly, it's a good place to get staff maybe into the rhythm of doing more on-demand training, and keeping the kind of face-to-face high-value work for when staff are moving role or learning a whole new process, or maybe this, if organisations had a clearer sense not just of trying to save money, but of some of this kind of training is more appropriate for some things and other kind of training for other things. I think that might be an opportunity.
Helen, should we move on to quadrant 4? So I'm conscious of time. We're getting so much really useful input that we're kind of like slowing down. So yeah, am I on number 4 now? Yeah.
Yes, that's great. We've covered quite a lot of this. Again, I think in line with teaching staff, and you and Tabitha may be able to correct me about this, the FE professional services staff were talking about their digital skills more often in all contexts, but as we've said, there were an awful lot of staff who still weren't ever feeling their digital skills were addressed. Support was also better in FE across all options, although I think the difference was a bit less marked than it was for teaching staff, where the difference between the two sectors was really very marked. In both sectors, only about a quarter of staff felt they were properly consulted about developments in the digital infrastructure, and quite a shocking number of staff felt they were never given the time and support to develop. Again, in line with that, FE staff were better informed about the range of responsibilities we asked about. We asked about all sorts of things like safe behaviour online, IPR, assistive and adaptive, and so on. FE staff again felt that they were better informed about their responsibilities than HE staff did, but there was really quite a high level of agreement, I think, from staff, certainly a lot higher than we would have got a few years ago, saying that they did know about some of these kind of core digital legal and ethical responsibilities. Again, in line with the kind of professional staff being more similar to students than to teaching staff, who tended to be a bit more negative, the professional staff, at least in this survey sample, were fairly positive about the support that they had. But again, when you start to drill down into that, they wanted that support to be more role-focused, more specialised, especially in FE. They felt that the time they spent on their training needed to be rewarded with some kind of accreditation, some proper recognition. And of course, time came up. As I've said before, both sectors had these concerns about health and well-being, which I thought was interesting, because again, I think a couple of years ago, we probably wouldn't have seen this coming up in a digital survey particularly. And there was lots of evidence. I think around about a quarter of staff in both sectors, when they were asked how could we support you better with your professional development, went back to infrastructure. So even though they'd been through all these questions about mentoring and workshops and online training, you know, with the expected response, well, you could support my development better by, you know, giving me better training. Still, a quarter of them are saying, actually, forget all the training till you get the infrastructure right. So, you know, strong story again to be told about how infrastructural problems can really limit not just what staff can do today, but their capacity to develop new skills for the future. Again, just over to you really to comment and add your own recommendations and key messages from that section, or anything we've talked about, and again to the team as well.
Did they give any more detail on what they meant by infrastructure in that last point?
Yeah, of course. So they didn't use the term infrastructure. That was my coding. They talked about, I think particularly the thing about flexible working, the thing about upgrades, the sense of just running to stand still meant that they couldn't ever develop, you know, significantly. So, you know, they were always trying to make things work, and that what they thought of as digital skills development was just solving the latest problem that the system upgrade or the infrastructure had thrown at them, rather than having a coherent, progressive, developmental kind of view of where do I want to be in my career and what skills do I need to get there.
It's an interesting comment from Christine here about how you say you're doing more sort of localized departmental training using teams, which is more beneficial because you can talk to the team about how they can put into practice. So rather than some bought off the shelf thing, you know, you can actually localize it, have the team talk to each other, talk about a problem and see how it can be solved. And that's a really useful idea. And Helen, your point about it is a kind of like a strand of it's formal support, but it's informal, it's that blurring of lines of just more flexible training, maybe just in time training. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Helen?
Yes, we probably should.
Yeah.
You.
Okay. Sorry, he hasn't got the title again.
That's fine. So this is just an update on what's happening, and again, the rest of the team can do some of the detail. But if you were to come onto the question launch webinar, you see both some sort of revised questions for professional services staff, but also for teaching staff and students in the different sectors. And what we've done there is to map the questions much more closely. So it'd be interesting to hear how many of you have used the professional services staff and compared it to the teaching staff survey. We want people to be able to really easily look across the questions and see what they're learning from different groups of people in their institution and how they might look at those things in respect to one another. There's going to be some brand new guidance on how to do that, how to use the surveys together to understand what's going on in the round. We are thinking, and this is worth putting in front of you guys, we're thinking that reporting might move towards being per sector. So our reports, our national reports tend to say, here's a comparison between FE and HE. We think actually what's more useful is to begin to really explore the findings within each sector rather than to do, you know, sometimes the comparisons are quite interesting, but, you know, they're not always the most important and actionable thing to come out of the surveys. I've just highlighted a few new things in each quadrant, really partly just to reassure you that the whole thing, this is Tabitha's phrase, but Tabitha said, you know, the whole thing's had a facelift, quite a significant facelift, hopefully not with the negative effects of that, but with just looking fresher and more integrated. But you will see new questions coming in. For example, just picking up the one on quadrant 2, because the free text data gave us some insights into what the impact of poor infrastructure is on professional practice, we've been able to surface some actual closed questions there, which will allow you in future not to have to find your way through all of that free text data, but to see, you know, what staff are saying the impact of poor infrastructure is on their ways of working. We're going to be differentiating professional staff by what they do rather than trying to fit them into sort of formal role categories, just because there's so much overlap, particularly in FE, and because it's so different in different organisations, we really didn't feel that was a useful thing to do, and so on. Tabitha, you've been, but you know, you may have many more things to say about this, and Mark and Ruth, if you want to come in as well, the way the service is going forward, please feel free to.
Thanks, Helen. I think that it's just a relief that people are feeding back. So far, the idea of moving to sector reports is going to be useful. We've had to go to a format of having one report per survey type, so the learners, the teachers, the professional services staff, because we have had a rollout of piloting each one of those and then embedding them within the entire service. Now that we have a coherent service, we have some surveys that have been piloted, and we have now had this review phase where we're ensuring there's consistency between those 3 survey types, soon to be 4 when we create an HE researchers version. So we will then be able to report at a sector level, so looking just at HE or looking just at FE, but from the different voices who work within that. And I hope that will be a really useful new phase from 2020.
Yeah, thanks, Tab. And just to add to that, as we've mentioned, we're going to be launching all the surveys next week, or the 3 surveys, so student, teaching staff and professional service staff. And we will be developing the research one in the winter and spring next year. So if you're interested in being part of that, please get in touch. As Mark's put there, there's a webinar on the 16th at 1 o'clock till 2 to go through the new questions with everybody, and we hope you'll join that. So as we mentioned, I know we're past time now, so thank you very much for your time today, and please do get in touch if you have any more reflections after this webinar today, and as Mark said, he'll send out a link to the recording.
Can I just say before we close that we also have a community of practice event on the 6th of November at Staffordshire University, and we'll be launching the results of the teaching staff survey on that day. I'll pop a link in the chat box.
Thanks for that, Claire. And also just to say that Tabitha and Helen are doing a briefing paper about this work, and once it's available, we'll circulate it all to you as well, and to encourage you to, if you haven't done yet, to complete the evaluation form if you run the survey this year. Does anyone else want to say anything more here? I think we've covered everything and we've gone over time quite a bit. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks for your feedback. It's been really, as usual, it's been really, really helpful, and it's a sign that we have gone over, that there's been, you know, we could have happily carried on talking about a lot of the things again, on and on and on. So thanks a lot. Look out on Jisc Mail for the webinar on the 16th, and thanks everyone for your time out, and thanks Helen and Tabitha for the presentation as well.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.